Yeah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khair, brothers, for attending this circle today. Today we have with us Shabir Ahmed, who's a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, who's going to be discussing a very important subject and a very interesting subject, and that is the compatibility between science and Islam. As we are well aware that there's a big confusion over this subject. In the West, we find that general Western thinkers and academics, they would sit and worship science, and they would say that if science, if things cannot be proved by science, then in essence they are not fact and they are not true for us, and we should reject them. And on the other hand, we find some people who would say that the science has no place in our lives at all, and all we should refer to is the divine text. So this confusion emerges as to what role does science play within a life. Is science something that should be rejected wholeheartedly, or is Islam something that should be accepted wholeheartedly? How should we view this subject? Inshallah, Shabir Ahmed would try to shed some light on this. So I'll pass you over to the speaker, after which we'll have some opportunity to entertain any questions and comments.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum, brothers. Since the birth of capitalism in Europe, one concept that has taken root in the minds of the Europeans is that science and religion do not mix. Mention the word religion to people, and what comes in their mind? It's backwardness, inflexibility, oppression, and exploitation. On the other hand, mention science to people, and they think about progress, hope, prosperity. And now with GM, with advances in GM, genetic engineering, it is immortality, that people believe that the science will solve the basic of problems, and that is that they will be able to live forever, that somehow it will preserve them for hundreds of years. And this concept, in fact, is widely held amongst the people, from the leading scientists to the politicians. Now, this concept originates in Europe, and it came about as a result of a very bad experience of the Europeans under Christianity. The church, which was in effect in a position of ruling or managing the people's affairs over the past few centuries, in fact oppressed the people here. The scientists and thinkers were not allowed to research and to develop and to invent. Rather, the church maintained its position by simply imposing its view on the people. So, in a reaction to that, the masses here wanted to get rid of religion, and so they managed to come out with a new way of life. So this is really in brief the origin of this concept here, and inshallah later on we'll look at it in a bit more depth. So what about the Muslims? What about our view on this subject? How do we hold science in relation to Islam? Well, before we look at Islam itself, let me first of all quote one of the leading directors in the West. She is Carly Fiorina, the chief executive of Hewlett-Packard. As most of you will know, Hewlett-Packard, commonly known as HP, is one of the world's largest IT companies. And let's see what she has to say about science and Islam. In her speech given to chief executives in America on 26th of September 2001, she summed up by saying, "I'll end by telling a story. There was once a civilization that was the greatest in the world. It was able to create a continental superstate that stretched from ocean to ocean and from northern climates to tropics and deserts. Within its dominion lived hundreds of millions of people of different creeds and ethnic origins. One of its languages became the universal language of much of the world, the bridge between the peoples of 100 lands. Its armies were made up of people of many nationalities, and its military protection allowed a degree of peace and prosperity that has never been known. The reach of this civilization's commerce extended from Latin America to China and everywhere in between. And this civilization was driven, more than anything, by invention. Its architects designed buildings that defied gravity. Its mathematicians created the algebra and algorithms that would enable the building of computers and the creation of encryption. Its doctors examined the human body and found new cures for disease. Its astronomers looked into the heavens, named the stars, and paved the way for space travel and exploration. Then Shim sums up, while modern Western civilization shares many of these traits, the civilization I'm talking about was the Islamic world, from the year 800 to 1600, which included the Ottoman Empire and the courts of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, and enlightened rulers like Suleiman the Magnificent. Although we are often unaware of our indebtedness to this other civilization, its gifts are very much part of our heritage. The technology industry would not exist without the contribution of Arab mathematicians. And perhaps we can learn lessons from his example, from these examples. And the last sentence, she said, this kind of enlightened leadership that nurtured culture, sustainability, diversity, and courage, led to 800 years of invention and prosperity. So this is the view held by the Westerners about Islam. And the Muslims were indeed the pioneers and inventors, and were recognized as world leaders in these fields. For those who want to shun history and pretend that Europe is the birthplace of scientific discovery and invention, should take a close look at the numerous Arabic words and scientific terms currently being used in the European languages. Words such as chemistry. Chemistry is a major science, a major branch of science. This comes from al-Khamiyya. Algebra comes from al-Jabr. Algorithm comes from al-Khwarizmi. Cipher, which means nothing, comes from the Arabic word sifr. The word alkali comes from al-Kali. And even words beyond the scientific arena, we find words like squadron for a section of the armed forces, and this word has been derived from the Arabic word askariya. And also the word admiral is derived from Amir al-Rahal, and there are many others. And some common expressions in English are derived from the Muslims. An example of this is when people say, stop speaking gibberish. You may have heard this statement from people. What does this mean? What they're trying to say to you is, look, I can't comprehend what you're saying. I don't understand what you're saying. Stop speaking gibberish. What this really basically is all about. The word gibberish, in fact, is derived from the Muslim mathematician Al-Jabr. And the saying goes that he was so advanced in mathematics that when his work reached Europe, the people of Europe could not understand what he was talking about. They could not comprehend these equations and understand the mathematics. Hence they said, look, this is all gibberish to us. Now, before looking at the factors that enable the Muslims to make remarkable progress in science and technology, I just want to touch two areas, a little bit more depth in fact. I want to touch on chemistry and mathematics, just to give you a few examples to illustrate the point I'm trying to make, that under Islam we made huge strides, and as recognized by Kali, the chief executive of HP. And thereafter, inshallah, we can then explain why the Muslim progressed so fast in such a short space of time. So let's take chemistry. Chemistry has always been a major work for the Muslims. Chemistry deals with composition and properties of substances and the changes of composition they undergo. It has been divided into inorganic and organic. The conception of this division in modern chemistry came from Al-Razi's classification of chemical substances into mineral, vegetable, animal. Jaber's contribution to chemistry in the 8th century Christian era is also great. He gave a scientific description of two principal operations of chemistry. One of them is calcination, which is employed in the extraction of metals from their ores. The other is reduction, which is employed in numerous chemical treatments. He improved upon the methods of evaporation, melting, distillation, sublimation, and crystallization. These are the fundamental methods employed in the purification of chemical substances, enabling the chemist to study their properties and uses, and to prepare them. The process of distillation is particularly used for taking extracts of plant material. The most important discovery made by Jabir was the preparation of sulfuric acid. The importance of this discovery can be realized by the fact that in this modern age, the extent of the industrial process of a country is mostly judged by the amount of sulfuric acid used in that country. Another important acid prepared by him was nitric acid. In the same century, Jabir's work was further advanced by Al-Razi, who wrote many volumes on chemicals and described a number of chemical instruments. He applied his chemical knowledge for medical purposes, thus laying the foundation of applied chemistry as we have it today. Abu Mansur distinguished between sodium carbonate and potassium carbonate. He had some knowledge of arsenious oxide, cupric oxide, antimony and other substances. The great Muslim surgeon Khalaf ibn Abbas al-Zuhri wrote a great number of medical encyclopedias. Ibn Sina, a name which is very familiar in the West also, wrote a treatise on minerals that provided one of the main sources of geological knowledge and chemistry in the Western Europe until the Renaissance in Europe. Now moving on to mathematics. The achievement of Muslims in the field of mathematics are extremely remarkable. A regular study of this science, like all other sciences, was begun during the time of the second Abbasi Khalifa, Al-Mansur, in the second half of the 8th century Christian era. During this period, the work on mathematics was exclusively accomplished by Muslims. Some stimulus came from the Indian and Greek works that were later translated into Arabic. During the 11th century Christian era, nearly all of the original and creative work was indeed done by Muslims. And even non-Muslims wrote all their mathematical works in Arabic. The Muslims used numbers, including the zero, for counting, in contrast with writing the amounts in words or counting with letters of the alphabet, as was the practice in Europe. Thus, they made arithmetic simple and applicable to the problems of everyday life in connection with commerce and trade. The number zero, as we can all appreciate, holds a great importance in arithmetic. Without the zero, it is not possible to indicate the figures like 10, hundreds, thousands, and so on. The West learned the use of numerals from the Muslims, and hence they're known as the Arabic numerals. The Christian mathematicians either used the old Roman numerals and the abacus, or used the Arabic numerals together with their old system. It was only in the 12th century Christian era that after learning from the Muslims, the Western scholars were able to produce some literature on the numbering system, without columns and which incorporated the zero. The system of named algorithms was derived by the Latin writers from Al-Khwarizmi, a distinguished Muslim mathematician, astronomer, and geographer of the 9th century Christian era. Algebra was made into exact science by the Muslims. Al-Khwarizmi named his book dealing with the subject as Kitab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the book of restitution and comparison. The word Jabr means restitution. It is the adding of something to a given sum or multiplying it so that it becomes equal to another value. The word Muqabala means comparison and is applied in comparing two sides of an equation, such as a plus b equals c. The word algebra, was originally used for simple operations like additions and multiplications, but later it evolved into an entire subject. In addition, the Muslims founded analytical geometry as well as plane and spherical trigonometry. By the end of the 10th century Christian era, the number of mathematicians increased immensely. Abu Kamil, who was one of the distinguished mathematicians of that period, perfected Al-Khwarizmi's work on algebra. He determined and constructed both roots of quadratic equations. He made a special study of the pentagon with algebraic treatment, mentioned the multiplication and division of algebraic quantities as well, resolved the system of equations up to 5 unknowns. So these are basically just some of the examples I wanted to mention for those who are not sure about the origins of our current scientific culture. Now, the question that arises for us now is, well, what led the Muslims to achieve so much? What were the factors? What was the impetus? What was the stimulus? Did the Muslim have something unique? Did they have some revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they in fact began to research and develop and become the world leaders? What was this factor? Is it that the Muslims faced many medical problems and they were forced into doing research and development to find cures for diseases? Is it that they traveled far and wide and they had to have knowledge of geography and navigation? Is it that they were hungry, they faced famines, so they developed agricultural sciences? Indeed, when you study the reality, you find that it's none of these factors. Because the non-Muslims faced the similar situation. For example, they also traveled. They also faced disease and hunger. So it's not unique for us as Muslims. We share a lot of things with non-Muslims in the sense that we're humans, they're humans. We have instinct, they have instinct. We have organic needs, they have organic needs. So there's no difference as far as we're concerned, as far as the humans are concerned. But the fundamental difference that we can observe between the Muslims and the non-Muslims, and especially those in Europe, was the fact that the Muslims lived under Islam. The Europeans lived in a system that was chaotic. They lived in a system that had no principles. They lived in a system where there were many competing forces at play. So the people were not unified on a common way of life, on common principles. They did not have a common basis to solve their issues. On one side you had the church, and the church preached its own doctrine. On the other side you had the rulers, the dictators, the kings, and they had their own agenda in this temporal life. So often there was a clash. So people did not know which way to turn. If they wanted to go in the temporal life, if they wanted to pursue science and technology and come out with theories, the church would stop them, saying, well, this goes against Christianity, and therefore you must be stopped. So under this climate, nobody made progress. But if you look at the Muslims, we lived under Islam. Islam is a way of life. There is a certain basis. There are principles in place. There is a common reference point for the people. And all matters of life are solved according to a common basis. So there are no competing forces within Islam. And this unifying force in Islam is basically our creed, the Aqidah of Islam. When we accept the Shahada, we say La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. We accept that our Creator is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there is no deity. There is no one other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who is our Creator. And we acknowledge, we accept that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the last and final messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Muslims live under a system which had this as the basis. And indeed, our focus on life was as defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. And that Allah tells us that Allah has not created the jinn or the man except as a worship to Him. So the Islamic Ummah had a focus in their life. They were organized, and there was no competition. There was no competing authorities within the Islamic household. And therefore this allowed us to make progress in many areas of life, not just science and technology, but also other areas of life. Furthermore, we see that there are no contradictions in Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of the universe. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who revealed Islam to us. So how can we possibly see, or how can we possibly accept that there are contradictions between Islam and a practical life and what Allah has created for us? If the source is the same, then surely there will be no contradictions. And this is exactly how we understand our situation. Also, we find that the leading scientists in the Islamic world were also leading scholars of the time. So there was a great harmony between the rules of Allah applied in society, the rules of Shara applied in society, and man's endeavor to find solution to his problem, the practical solution to the problems that he faced. And we know from the Quran itself that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about the world that we live in, this material world we live in, that He has made it as subservient to mankind. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Hajj 65, Alam tara an Allah sahara lakum fil ard. Do you not see that Allah has made subservient to you whatsoever is in the earth? So it's only natural that man will explore, research and invent. And this is exactly what the Muslims did. However, an important impetus for us that we should never forget, and this is a very important point, is that Islam has laid down a fundamental obligation on the Muslims, and that obligation is jihad fi sabilillah. Jihad is the tool which we use to take dawah to the non-Muslims. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ وَلَا تَعْدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. This is Al-Baqarah 190. Fight in the cause of Allah, those who fight you, but do not transgress limits, for Allah loves not the ones who transgress. So the word jihad here, in fact, is misunderstood greatly. Jihad is about taking Islam to people. It's not all about killing, fighting. The first part of jihad is really the invitation to Islam, and the last part of jihad is removing the physical obstacles. So you may say, well, what is the link between science and Islam and jihad? What is the link here? Well, the issue for us is this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in other parts of the Quran, in Surah Anfal, He has made it an obligation on the Muslims to prepare themselves. Allah says, the meaning of which is, prepare your strength to the uttermost of your power, including steeds of war, to strike terror into the hearts of your enemies. So we know from this verse of the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obliged the Muslims to equip themselves so that we can strike terror into the hearts of non-Muslims, those people who oppose the dawah, those people who want to fight Islam. So this obligation of jihad imposed on the ummah, and the obligation for the ummah to prepare materially, in fact gave us a very important job to do, and that is that we must prepare ourselves militarily. In the days of the old, preparation for military was what? Having a lot of horses, having the best swords, the best fighters, having a lot of archers. And that would have struck fear in the hearts of the enemies. But in today's world, what will strike fear in the heart of the Americans? Or in the heart of the American military establishment? It is having the latest tanks, the latest and the best tanks, the missiles, aircraft carriers, and nuclear capabilities. So this obligation, in fact, then provides us the stimulus that we need to research into science and technology. For we cannot develop tanks, we cannot design the best aircraft, we cannot have nuclear capability unless we understand this material world, unless we advance in technology, unless we understand science. So the study of science and study of technology, in fact, becomes a duty on us. And the principle in Islam, which we are aware of, that whatever leads to accomplishment of a wajib, in itself becomes a wajib. So this applies here, that to strike the fear into the heart of the enemy, we need weaponry, and weaponry cannot be manufactured unless we have the know-how. And this then obliges us to study, look into science and technology. So this is a very important stimulus for us, a strong motivation for us. So, in summary, we can say that the Muslims made huge strides in science and technology because they adopted an ideology, adopted a way of life. An ideology, by definition, gives people a common set of principles which dictate how they live their lives and resolve issues they encounter in society. So it's not the genius of Arabs, the Berbers, the Indians, the Turks, to which we attribute our scientific culture. It's none of these, but rather it's Islam. It's that focus on the Aqidah, it's the direction provided to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that in fact brought us at the forefront of technology. And this fact is undisputable, that it's this ideology, it's Islam, which allowed us to progress. Without Islam, without an ideology, we will not have reached this status. And really, I mean, if for those who want more evidence, I mean, let's just quickly ponder at how Islam transformed the people. If you study pre-Islamic Arabia, what will you find in that land? You would find people engrossed in the deepest of the Jahiliyyah. People who used to bury their daughters alive. People who used to fight wars, clans, tribes used to fight wars over a camel or a horse. And these wars these feuds would last 20, 30, 40 years, and they will kill thousands on both sides. That society was a society where the women used to dance around the Kaaba naked. This is the kind of society that existed before Islam came. People who could not read or write, people who were complete jahil in every sense of the word. But when Islam was revealed to them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened up their hearts. And within a period of 200 years, those very people became the rulers of the world. And they defeated and they wiped out many empires. Some of the most strongest and the biggest empires that ever existed up until that time. The Romans, the Persians. Undisputed people, undisputed power, phenomenal power at their hands. But yet, Islam transformed the nomads, the Jahil people, into the people who would carry this Islam to the world. So this is really an example in front of us. No one can dispute this. Non-Muslims cannot dispute this. So definitely it's the ideology that transformed the people. And then that gave boost to science and technology. To add to those examples, well, let's focus now on Europe. Now, before the Europeans adopted capitalism, capitalism is a way of life. It's an ideology. Before they adopted that, some 300 to 400 years ago, what do we find in Europe? Europe was living under oppression of the church. As I said at the beginning of this talk, that many people were suppressed, scientists were suppressed, thinkers were suppressed, and there was no progress made in any walks of life here. But when they actually divorced religion from the state, when they adopted a new way of life called capitalism, suddenly it gave a rise in the Industrial Revolution. It gave a new meaning to life for these people. And within 100 years, the Europeans, in fact, made many, many strides in the field of science and technology, amongst other things. And then they became very powerful. We know about the Industrial Revolution. We've seen it. We read about it. We have understood this subject. We have studied our history here. And the Industrial Revolution, in fact, was as a result of capitalism being applied in this in Europe. So it's not the other way around, as many people would have it, that it was the science and technology that in fact changed Europe. That somehow these people got together and says, hey, we need to discover things. So let's invent machinery, let's invent warships, let's invent guns, and this will lead us towards overtaking the world, and we can become powerful. No, this is wrong actually. They first of all adopted a common set of principles. They adopted an ideology, and then once they've done that, then Industrial Revolution came, because it freed up people to think and invent and to progress. Another example perhaps we can give is the example of communism. Despite the fact that the communist ideology is flawed, but nevertheless, if you just look at the scientific advances of the communists, you'll find that within the space of 50 years, they've actually put up satellites from zero, from scratch. They had nothing when there was a revolution in Russia. But within 50 years, 60 years, they were competing with America in terms of science and technology. They had nuclear weapons, they had satellites, they had everything that Americans had. So again, this is as a result of application of ideology, which gave fruits to science and technology. So finally, I'd like to basically sum up by saying that Islam, in fact, does not stop people from studying the physical world around us, from discovery, from invention. As long as our actions are confined to Sharia, Islam gives free hand to people to solve our practical problems that we face, whether these problems are related to medicine, disease, whether it's related to agriculture, that we want to increase the yield of a production, whether it's associated with travel, that we want planes and cars and so on. Islam indeed allows us to research into these areas and develop these technologies. And the experience of the Europeans, in fact, is unique for the Europeans. We cannot generalize from their experience. Yes, they suffered, we know that, definitely. But this concept, this notion that religion and science do not mix is false as far as Islam is concerned. There is no problem with compatibility. Islam is a way of life, and it encompasses science and technology, because these are part and parcel of our lives. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
Jazakallah khair, Shabir. sure many of you have many questions you want to raise. If you just raise your hands, inshallah. The brother over there.
Assalamu alaikum.
Islam.
I mean, what you've highlighted very clearly, that Islam's history is tremendous, and what it has to offer is even more. And you've highlighted how the power of thought, the Islamic thought, brought about many Islamic discoveries. So shouldn't we use science to prove to the non-Muslims who base and believe everything on science that the Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Okay. Yes, to answer that, I mean, first of all, let's look at the reality of science, and let's look at the reality of Islam. What is science all about? Science really is understanding our physical world. Science is all about understanding our physical world. Science tells us about the material, all the relationships between the matter, the rules and regulations that the matter is governed by. It's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created in matter. So science is about studying how things work, how matter works. What is this matter? Now, if I give you an example, using science, we can measure the average speed of a car. So if you stand on a road and you mark 2 points on a road, point A and point B, using science, you can actually time the car, and then you can work out the average speed of the car because you know the distance it travels. So what is the speed of the car? What is the average speed of the car? How long it took? You can measure that using science. But now, if you were to ask the question, well, why did the person go from point A to B? Does science have an equation that answers that? Why? No, it doesn't. So here is the fundamental limitations of science. Science only tells you about how things work, not why. So anything in the realm of why, we cannot use for science for that. So this limitation indeed must be understood. And once we understand that, then we'll come to an important conclusion, and that is that science cannot be used in every sphere of life. Now, when it comes to the actual this question about the Quran and proving whether the Quran is from Allah or not, and so on, using science, well, science is very limited, and our understanding of this reality continues to change. Science, in fact, does not give us exact knowledge of this world. Yes, we keep on refining our knowledge. Year by year, there's more research is carried out, more people who investigate, they experiment, and so on. Our understanding of the fundamental laws probably become better and better, but we will not have the exact knowledge of this world. Therefore, there are limitations to that. And if that is the case, then we cannot really begin to answer the very fundamental questions that are raised about whys. So science has its application, and that application is not to look at the Quran itself. Now let me give you one example of this. If you were to use science, now the Quran mentions a lot of physical phenomena. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sheds light on some aspect of a physical world. For example, He talks about how a child is born, the fetus. He talks about the two seas mixing. Allah talks about how milk is created, and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala touches on many of these issues just for us to ponder over. It's not really a book of science as such. It doesn't give you equations, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to encourage us to think about the world as a path towards proving that this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But now let's say a scientist takes one of these examples and he says today, well, according to our scientific understanding today, this fits in what the Quran says, and therefore based on that we say the Quran is the truth and it is right, and therefore it's from Allah, and I agree with that and accept that. But tomorrow now, if that particular scientific understanding changes, then what implication does that have? The implication then is that, well, now our understanding is correct, the one previously was wrong, therefore the Quran is wrong. Because our understanding has changed now, and this is no longer in tune with the Quran, so therefore Quran is wrong, and therefore people may leave Islam. So therefore we never use science to actually look at the Quran and to prove that. The Quran itself, in fact, we must use a rational method. When it comes to the issues of Aqidah, in terms of the belief, revelation, the creator, the universe, where did man come from, where is going, all of these areas must be addressed by rational method, rational thinking. What is rationality? What is the rational method? It's all about really sensing the reality through our senses, using previous information, using our mind, and coming to some comprehension, some understanding about this world. That is the realm of rationality. But science has limitations, and therefore science cannot be used in this area, as we know that our understanding of science changes day by day, and it's never exact knowledge. So therefore we should never attempt to use science to prove that the Quran is word of Allah, or to prove Allah exists or doesn't exist.
Okay, does that answer your question? I can see that there's a lot of hands up. I'll take the rubber right at the back over there.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
You have highlighted in your talks how science and technology better life for the Europeans, and because we divorce religion from life, should we be focused on developing our countries in terms of technology, improving our situation as a European did to divorce the religion from life as well?
Well, I mean, the Europeans, the position where they are now, in fact, came about as a result of changes in their way of life. It is not a product of development, science and technology. Now, as far as we're concerned in our countries, there are some people who say that, look, we've got to spend a lot of our time in education, we must develop our universities, we must develop laboratories, we must take from the West, we must compete with the West. And once we have this technology in our hands, then we can begin to redress the balance that the West has overtaken us. Now, there is a flaw with this, and that is that you will never have an environment, you will never be able to acquire technology under the current political framework in the Muslim countries. Why? Because our countries are subjugated to capitalism. They are influenced by the Western powers, and these countries will not allow you to research and develop science and technology. They will not allow you to run your affairs. Why? Because our political system does not safeguard our interests. So if we now want to progress in this field, first and foremost we have to change our system that governs our lands. And that is that we must remove capitalism or any other system in place and replace it with Islam. Islam will provide us security. That's the first point. Secondly, Islam will focus the Ummah on the objective set by Islam, on jihad, on research and development for the sake of jihad. Thirdly, Islam will then provide us the correct resources under which then we can develop science and technology. So this question, I mean, sometimes people are trying to put the cart before the horse, so to speak, really. That we're trying to do something which really can only be done once the system has changed. So what I would say is that the priority for us at the moment is that we should change the political system in the Muslim world. And once that system is changed, once we establish Islam, the Islamic State, and then, no doubt, within a very short period of time, we will have achieved the success the West has achieved. After all, this is our culture, this is our heritage. We, as an ummah, we are the pioneers, we are the inventors. We have to lay down the foundation of science and technology. Almost every other term used in chemistry comes from the Arabic language. So it won't be long before we regain our position of strength and leadership in this field. But we have to change our political systems. There's no other way. We have tried that in the past. I mean, let me give you an example of Iraq. It's a relevant example now. When Saddam Hussein tried to establish a nuclear reactor, what happened? Got bombed. Because he didn't have any defenses, he had no support, and the Israelis were simply able to fly their planes and destroy that plant. And the same thing can happen. The enemies of Islam can use any nation to strike at us because we are weak, we are divided. So we have to defend ourselves, we have to be secure before we can progress in these areas. And that will only come about by establishing Islam as a way of life.
Okay, brother over there.
Assalamu alaikum.
Islam.
I want to ask a question regarding the Islamic methods. Does the Islamic method have any place in Islam or Islamic society?
There is a lot of debate actually about this issue, and we know that in the West scientific methods in fact are applied everywhere. But let's draw the line between the rational method and the scientific method. The rational method is the natural way for man to think. As a man, it is really the sensing of reality by man. His senses, he senses the reality. Man has previous information, he uses that. There is something called the mind, the aql, Allah has provided, and then we pass a judgment on something. This is the rational process of thinking. This is the rational method. Now, the scientific method is a particular approach that is taken to study something tangible, such as rocks or metals. It is the observation of the thing under experimentation, with the object being subjected to new conditions. Previous information is all stripped from the experiments, so observation is done in isolation. An example of this is determining how a metal will behave under different temperatures. So you get a metal bar and you pull it from both ends and see at what point it breaks under different temperatures. So at 0 degrees centigrade, you actually subject this metal to strain and you observe the behavior. Then you repeat the experiment again at 50 degrees centigrade, and then you can repeat it at 100 degrees and 200 degrees. So you're building up really a pattern of behavior of metals. But this is pure experimentation, repeated time after time after time. Now, the results that you get from the experiments are never exact. This is the very important point. They are never exact. You get an approximation of how the metal behaves, but you cannot ascertain complete knowledge from this, because experiments are prone to error. We as human beings, we are prone to error. So therefore, we say that the scientific method or the scientific approach, in fact, it is a correct approach, but it's only applicable in the field of research, science and technology. So yes, answering your question, in Islam or under Islamic rule, under Islamic society, yes, we will employ scientific method, but it is employed in where it is useful most. And in fact, scientific method is part of the rational method. The rational method, in fact, is what should be the basis of thinking. It should be the basis of our approach. And the scientific method is an aspect of that, when we want to ascertain a particular reality on a tangible object. So yes, it has uses, but it's not the basis of our thinking. And we will not make it the basis of thinking as the West have done.
Okay, so brother over there.
Assalamu
Alaikum salam.
Recently, I've heard a lot about genetic engineering for humans. Is this something Islam allows?
To tell you the truth, I mean, it's a big subject actually, and I'm not a scholar. Currently, I mean, we need to do a lot of ijtihad in that, and the Muslim scholars need to look into all the details of genetic engineering because it's so complex, this field, and it has many implications. But if I just give you some principle behind this, perhaps we can begin to understand this subject. Islam allows, the use of various things for the sake of medicine. Islam, in fact, does not restrict us using things which are generally forbidden for the sake of curing someone. For example, the use of drugs is not permitted under normal situation. It's haram to consume drugs. But under a certain condition, if you're involved in a car crash and you're in hospital, it's a life-threatening situation, then Islam would permit the use of certain drugs for treatment to kill the pain and so on. Now, in the same way, genetic engineering, if it involves in use of medical application, perhaps someone has a cancer or some other disease, and perhaps the GM technology helps in order to cure that disease or to relieve the symptoms, then perhaps it may be allowed. But again, the scholars would need to look at details in this matter to give the fatwa and judgment. But in principle, it would seem that it will be able, we can use these technologies for the sake of medicine. But in the West, in fact, genetic engineering is used for all sort of things, and for one thing, they're looking for really designer babies, and they're looking for cosmetic changes, and they're looking for do all these sort of weird things for the sake of beauty and the looks and so on. And that approach, in fact, is not shared by us. As Muslims, we are not allowed to tamper with a body that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. We are not allowed to overstep the line that Sharia has defined for us. So anything, if it's purely for cosmetic and involves changing your body, involves cutting your body, involves injecting your body in something and could harm the body, in fact, may not be allowed from Islam and will be ruled out. But if it's for the sake of medicine, to save someone's life, then in those circumstances, I understand that a lot of these issues could be permitted. But I'm not a scholar, so I can't give you an exact answer for that. Each reality needs to be looked into. And maybe, inshallah, some scholars will do some ijtihad at some point on these issues to determine the exact uses, and so on.
Okay, brother here. Alaikum salam.
How do you resolve contradictions that may appear between Islam and science?
Well, first and foremost, actually, as a Muslim, our belief basically tells us that the origin of man, universe, life, everything is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Islam is revealed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We cannot comprehend any contradictions between that. This is a very fundamental issue for us. But as for our misunderstanding of the physical world, yes, there could be a case where we observe something in the reality, we look into the Quran itself, and we cannot match the two up. In this case, we ditch our experiments and our reality and we go what the Quran tells us. So we need to go back to our methods and refine understanding of the reality. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about the mixing of the two seas, they don't mix, there's a barrier between them. There are various verses in the Quran who mention this issue. And we go and we research the seas and the waters and see how the two seas mix, and we should look at the barrier and what is it that separates the two seas, the mixing of the fresh sea and the salt and so on. Now, we cannot then obviously, based on this reality, go to the Quran, and if there's a difference, we cannot now say, well, one is wrong and the Quran could be wrong. No, from a aqidah, from a belief, no, the Quran is the truth. This is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if we don't understand, if we can't match up the two, then we go back to our real world and investigate again and look at that. But the ultimate source for us is the Quran, and that is the basis. And we would not deviate from that.
Sorry, I didn't see you there.
So, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Sorry, I didn't just got a bit late, so I'm not sure if you covered this issue. Regarding that, you mentioned that ijtihad and science itself. As we look in the past, we see that there was ijtihad done related to Islam and issues of science, and like printing machine, telephones and so forth. These were scholars forbid this, and still we see today in the Muslim world that certain scholars forbid this to use within certain countries. So now you're trying to address science itself would be beneficial to actually utilize that. But we see that the ones who do refer to Islam as scholars, they're actually forbidden to actually go into science. How would you express that?
When you look into the history and all those fatwas given, in fact, you'll find that a lot of the scholars of the time, and this is particularly in the last few decades of the Uthmani Khilafah, that we find actually that many fatwas were given. And as you mentioned in your question about banning the printing machines and the telephone lines, and it is stated that some scholars said that if you use the telephone, then you're speaking to shaitan at the other end, and therefore don't use it. It's not allowed for us to use that. Now, the issue for us is that we've got to distinguish between science, scientific facts, and Islam and a way of life. Now, in terms of way of life, in terms of what controls their action, that is Shara. That is the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is a unique source. That is a revealed source. So how we live our life, how do we interact with people, how we have relationship with each other, that is guided by revelation. But when it comes to using equipment, using machinery, using things from this reality, then basically this is understanding of science, this is understanding of technology. Now, Islam does not prevent us from using technology as long as our actions related to that particular machine or apparatus is confined by Shara. Now, in the past, the Muslim scholars, and this is the recent past, we're not talking about the golden period of Islam and earlier because it was very clear for them, but we're talking about the recent history here. People were not able to distinguish between these two factors. So they thought that anything that originates from the non-Muslims indeed is not allowed. So if the Kafir have designed a car, we should not use the car because it's not our invention. But what they don't realize is that science is a universal thing. Anybody can actually discover a law, anybody can design a car. It is not linked to your aqidah, it's not linked to your viewpoint of life. If you sit here and you study mathematics, you can solve various equations. This is just the knowledge that you gained. You can go out there and you can learn about cars and you can go and design a car, design an engine. Now this is about universal science. Anybody can do that. This is not related to Islam, this is not related to Christianity. It's understanding your reality around you. And this is acceptable for us. And we know that technology was used even by the Prophet ﷺ, which did not originate from the Muslims. We have an example of the ditches being used in warfare. This was technique of the time, and we know that Romans were used to using it. So Salman al-Farsi suggested to the Prophet ﷺ that we should use perhaps ditches in warfare, because the Quraysh were not used to fighting wars with ditches, trenches. So therefore, it was thought about this and it was accepted. Because digging up a trench, in fact, has nothing to do with Aqidah of Islam. It's a military tactics. And therefore it was used. And likewise, we have many examples. So in the future, what we can say is that even if the kuffar has designed a machine, even if they have discovered a particular law, even if they had invented something, we can take that and use it. There is no problem with that. But obviously our actions, how we use that thing, obviously must be confined by Sharia. So for example, television was invented by the West. So television by itself, it's not that good or bad. It's just a machinery, just an apparatus, just an electronic device. But it's an action related to that. If we use the television to look at nature programs, to record and see talks and conferences in Islam, or education purposes, these are all permitted, and these are good uses of television. But if we use television for films, entertainment, and all the other bad stuff, then it's not permitted for us to use the television. So it's not the television itself; it's our action, how we use that. So in the like way, we'd say that all technology, this is universal, and therefore we will be able to adopt from the kafirs. So don't have this notion that once we establish Islam as a way of life, that we're going to start from scratch, that we're going to go back to 400 years where we left off, and pick up books of Ibn Sina, Ibn Khaldun, and then we start from there and say, okay, now where do we go from here? Where the West has gone on the moon. No. We will take what knowledge we have today, we will take it from the West or the East, and then we will continue developing that, because this is universal, and this is not linked to Aqidah. What we don't take are the ways of life from the West, or from anywhere else in fact. How we form our relationships, how we run our systems, how we run our country. This comes from Islam, and that comes from revelation, and that's something that we don't take. So this distinction must be made between the two. In the past they failed to do that, hence we ended up in huge problems.
Okay, I've got a question. You mentioned clearly that there's no role for there's no role for science in proving or justifying the belief of the Muslim, whether it's to do with the proof that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, or the fact that the Quran is indeed the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But I've read many books and listened to many talks and browsed many articles on the internet where people would actually use science as a justification to prove the Islamic rules, the ahkam of Islam. So for example, many articles have been written with regards to the rules of Salah. So one such opinion that I read was that when the Muslim does sujood in his prayer, he's just discharging some energy and discharging some forms of electrons through the ground, like an earth on an electric wire. Or the fact as to why is it that the Muslim women that would cover themselves with the khimar. One opinion I read based upon some scientific research, on how bona fide this research is I don't know, but they said that the women, their hair gives off certain types of electrons, and this attracts the opposite sex, and as a result of that they have to cover their hair, and if they don't cover their hair then this could cause problems in society. So Islamic rules indeed have been justified on the basis of Islam. How would you respond to this, and what's your opinion on this?
Well, following on from some of the earlier questions and what was discussed before that, when it comes to the issues of relationships in society, we are governed by Sharia. Now, as to why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us to pray 5 times a day and why not 6 times a day, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has asked the woman to cover up and not for the man to cover his hair, for example, and women have to cover their hair. This information, it's only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We cannot ascertain all of the knowledge. It's only what Allah tells us. We cannot, because of the limitation of man, we are unable to comprehend a lot of these rules. This is beyond our comprehension. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best why He's doing that. So there is no rational argument, there's no scientific argument for us to say that it's best to pray Salah 5 times a day and not 7 times a day. If it was left to rationality, then perhaps someone would say, well, let's pray Salah in the morning, because you wake up, as the first thing you do, pray Salah, and then pray in the evening when you go to bed. Start of the day, end of the day, and everything in between is covered. If that was rationality, then we'll do that. But that's not the case. The issue of Masai, wiping over the socks. When you do wudu and you want to travel, Islam has permitted you to wear the socks, and then you can do Masa over that, so you don't have to take the socks off to wash your feet. Now, we have to wipe over on top of the feet. So it's like, you wet your hand and you wipe on top of the foot. So if it was rationality, if it was any scientific equation behind it or some other things, then we'll think, well, it's bottom of the foot that gets dirty, doesn't it? So when we're doing the wudu, why don't we wipe the bottom of the foot? It doesn't make sense to wipe at the top. So there's a lot of things like that in Islam where we cannot comprehend, and it's very dangerous trying to go into this area because we have no knowledge of that. And I'll tell you how limited man is. I mean, if we're in this lecture here and someone knocks on the door, indeed, we can hear that someone has knocked on the door, but can we see the person behind the door without having TV and cameras and all of that? But with the naked eye, can we see who's behind the wall? We cannot ascertain that information. We cannot see because we're limited. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not given us the power to see through walls and doors. So although we can ascertain and we can sense the reality, yes, there is a person behind that wall because we heard the knock, but we cannot see the person. Now that is the limitation of humans. So if we can't even see behind a wall, then how are we going to try to understand, the workings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and why He has us to do these things? So it's a very, very dangerous area. We should never delve into these, because if you can come out with a theory, then you've got to if you come out with a view, you have to back it up with what Allah has told you. If you cannot find it in the book of Allah and the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in relation to the revelation law, then we are not allowed to speculate. We are not allowed to delve into that area. And indeed, it becomes maybe even sinful, and we could even get punished by the state for delving into an area which we have no knowledge. And if you look into the history of the Khulafa, especially the first four Khulafa, you'll find some examples. And I understand, if I remember correctly, that one of the persons during the time of Hazrat Umar was delving in some of these issues about the hands of Allah and so on. Now we know in the Quran Allah mentioned about the hands of Allah, but how do we comprehend that? How do we know what is the hand of Allah? Is the hand like our hand, or is there something else? We don't know. We simply take what Allah has told us. But I believe that this man delved into details of this, and he was punished from the state for delving into area which he should not have delved into. So I don't know where these people get these notions from, but we should absolutely keep clear from these issues, for if they are not mentioned in the Quran, then we cannot proceed to answer them.
Okay, Jazakallah. I think we've got room for one last short question before we finish.
Walaikum Assalam.
If you look at the golden era of Islam, you find that within the Islamic world you had institutions like Cordoba, Baghdad, Damascus, and Al-Azhar, and you'd find that even the people in the West would come and educate their children in our institutions in the Muslim world. Unfortunately today you find the reverse has happened. So you find that the Muslim parents now who reside in the Islamic world, they will send their children to institutions within the West, whether it's within Boston, whether it's MIT, Massachusetts, whether it's Cambridge and Oxford in London. Yeah, this is what you find is happening today. And on top of that, when you look today in Islamic world also, you find that within certain countries, you find that we have qualified people who have degrees, who have PhDs, who have MScs. And unfortunately, these people do not have the jobs within our Islamic countries. So they come to the West. So you find within Britain itself, you find that the top heart surgeons are Muslims from Egypt. If you go to America and you look at NASA Space Agency, you'll find that the top scientists there who do research into space travel, into satellite technology, are Muslims again. Yeah. So there is a massive brain drain in this sense. Yeah. So what exactly do we do to revive Islam in terms of science? Because we have this.
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, alluded to this before, discussed some aspect of it, that we have plenty of people. I mean, we have a massive number of Muslims in the West who are in science and technology, and they're leaders in their field. But the problem is that we are unable to utilize their skills at this moment in time. Why? Because the Muslim world is in turmoil. Our countries have been divided. Our countries are subjugated to foreign powers. They invade us, they loot us, they murder us. They use B-52 bombers. So really our life in the Muslim world, is wrecked. And therefore we cannot even begin to think about science and technology when you got B-52 bombers raining down bombs on you. So the priority at the moment seems to be that we want to defend ourselves. So what I'm trying to say is that the current climate that we have in the Muslim world will not allow and does not allow advances in science and technology, because that's the least of things in our mind. So the way to really, if we want to make progress in this area, we have got to secure ourselves. We have got to change our system in our countries. And the only way we can do that is through the political work. Once we change the politics of our countries, once we unify the Muslims under one system, then we can begin to bring all these Muslim scientists and engineers back to the Islamic world, and then give them the laboratories, give them the resources, and say, well, we have these practical problems, go and solve them. And indeed, they will be the first one to go and solve those problems. And I've spoken to many people, and they're craving to go back, but they can't, because no jobs for them to go back. In fact, if they go back now, they may even be subjected to torture or even killing, because the people there don't want highly qualified people to come back. The system, that is. Not the people, but the system itself. So they stay here, and because they have no option but to stay here. But we should try our effort. We should try our best. All the Muslims, in fact, should work very hard in order to bring about that change in our countries. So inshallah, that we can get back to the position we were a few hundred years back.
Okay,
and before.
Take definitely the last question from the brother here. We've been waiting patiently.
Just on the point you just mentioned, when the Khilafah, inshallah, when we resume the Islamic way of life, then will there be any difference in the way that we prioritize the scientific, our direction in science compared to the way the West does? So for instance, a lot of their laboratories will be developing, like you mentioned, beauty products and things like this. Will there be any priorities which our viewpoint in life would give as far as how we would use science and the inventions in order to push us forward in the right direction?
If you look at the West, in fact, you'll find that their priority seems to be in their social life, in entertainment, in fashion, in profit making. But when it comes to science and technology, in fact, you'll find that the priorities of the Western world, in fact, it's related to military. It's related to securing their way of life. All of the inventions in the West came as a result of their military endeavors. The need to defend themselves and the need to propagate their way of life and to colonize other countries. And if you look at the internet, there's a latest example for us, and the computers. These came about as a result of their research and development related to defense against the Russians. But as a result of that, and afterwards, these sciences spilled over and became used in the public arena. Now, as far as we're concerned, as Muslims, as I mentioned before, our obligation, the top priority for the Ummah, is to take Islam to mankind. And it's taking Islam to mankind means that we must have the material power with us to remove any obstacle that we'll face. So, in the light of this obligation, basically all our priorities are defined. That number one priority is for us to look at how we're going to carry Islam to mankind. So we have to develop our defenses, we have to have the army, we have to have the ammunition, so that we can then confront those who are in the path of Islam. But the spin-offs of those industries obviously will be useful, and we will use them in hospitals, in laboratories, in schools, and so on. Now, we will not encourage people, and indeed there would not be anybody going into the arena, going into a scientific area just for the sake of profit, and money, and these kind of things, because the priority in the whole society is going to be towards Islam, inshallah. And the makeups and the cosmetic industry and all this fashion will be the least on our minds. When we understand Islam, when we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will account us in their judgment for actions, then everything basically gets crystallized for us. So inshallah, in the future Khilafah state, the whole of the state's priorities will be driven by what Islam demands of us, taking the dawah to mankind.
Okay, just to make a quick point on that, we know that as an advantage, my wife is a scientist and she works at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And we often have discussions about science and technology and about medical science in particular. And one of the things that she comments on a lot is the pessimism that exists within the scientific world, especially in the medical field, on how scientists and doctors become very frustrated when a sick child is sitting in front of them and they have the latest technology in the world, yet they cannot save this person. And many people will make comments like, if only there was a cure for this particular disease, whether the disease was related to viral diseases or whether bacteria and so on. And we know from Islam, and this is an advantage that we have over other beliefs, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us via His blessed Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that for every disease there is a cure except death. So we know that every disease, it has a cure. The issue is we just have to find it. Whereas the kuffar, and they don't even know whether there's actually a cure for a disease. All they can do is just hope and study hard to try and find one, not knowing if there actually is any light at the end of the tunnel. So on that note, I think we have all the keys. All we need, inshallah, is the infrastructure and the state to harness all the resources that we have, inshallah, so we can flourish. I'll ask the brother to end with a quick dua, and then we'll call today's proceedings to a close, inshallah.
Inshallah, brothers, whenever we end any meeting or any session, it's best to read Surah Al-Asr. This is the recommended practice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر.